because they did exist, these countries, for example, Britain and Germany and France and Italy and all of that. So they, in one hand, had been actively working in weakening the empire. How so? Of course, through the infiltration, because remember, those of you who are new to these discussions, may have difficulty in piecing together the discussion, the points that I'm relating, but if you recall what I had said, it was, subhanAllah, it is the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that when one nation is to decline, the other one is to be on the rise. It is something that we see simultaneously in the history taking place. It doesn't have to be just ours, it could be also others. So the time when Ottomans were on the rise in their strength, there was the other communities and nations were on the weak state and in very vulnerable state, dark ages basically. But it was this period, 17th century, the period of enlightenment, period of revolution and change and discovery and inventions. So as this started, so they started to, because of that, become stronger. They started to become stronger and more and able to exert more influence. So they were able to develop such a sophisticated, advanced system in their military, and also their politics and economy, and the culture as a result of that. So as today, when you travel to Arab world, when you travel to East, they really feel proud to take on the culture and the practice and the lifestyle of the West, right? We live here, we know, but in our countries, although it is slowly fading away, but up until recent time, this was a very powerful thing. This is why those countries that had been colonized by, whether it's British or French and whatnot, France, so they, although left the territory, geographically speaking, no longer having that authority, but they enslaved the minds of the younger generation. Right? And therefore, they feel pride to speak the language, to dress like the Westerners and whatnot. So when they started to become stronger in that sense, obviously the young generation, and especially the Ottoman Empire, there were some of the Khulafa within the empire, for example, Salim, one of them, not the first one, rather one of the other Khulafa within the empire, his name was Salim, who was very much in infatuation and fascinated with the French culture, French language and art and also literature and whatnot. So France has also interesting history, So that became one of the catalysts in this regard. So the European culture and of course their military advancement. And so it was here in 16th century, because up until this time, if you look at the beginning period of the Ottoman Empire, Khulafa themselves, the Amir himself will go in battle along with the other soldiers, the Muslim one. But now 16th century and around this time, they, in order to advance and enhance their military skills, they not only hired professional trainers from Germany and other places, but also had recruited from many of these Christian communities soldiers to work for them. They were not Muslims. To work for the Ottomans and for their army. So this was one thing. Of course, when they came and they brought their own culture and the influence as well, right? And so that was one, and of course politically they were becoming stronger and more, because it was also the same time where they had broken free from the religious oppression. Now they had sidelined the religion completely. All they wanted was just the focus and the progress, secularism, which eventually became secularism later on. So that was another thing. So this idea also affected a lot, and the economy also was boosting because of these types of in subhanallah discoveries and the rest. So as they were becoming stronger on these fronts, Ottoman Empire was becoming weaker, militarily speaking, financially speaking, politically speaking. So this was one, and all of these countries, they had, allied internally to do this against the Ottoman. Greece, Serbia, Italy, Germany, France, Britain, these countries. So this is one. Now, as time progressed, we had another external element that was very much active in this regard to completely, demolish this whole Khilafah system, and that was the Jewish community. That was the Jewish community, and so as I have repeatedly mentioned, so that we understand this and that we allow our mind to fully, accept and sink this in. What we see today in terms of the support, the lobby, the privilege, and the massive, today, no ruler in the West will openly be able to speak against them. That by default, that's the state. But all of this, like I said, changed not very long ago. Of course, there is a history behind it, but it took some time. But it all slowly started from 18th century. The situation started to change for the Jews in Europe in the 18th century. For example, this word ghetto, right? We all are familiar with this word ghetto, right? What does it mean? Ghettoized community, very marginalized, poor, ignored, abandoned community. Where does this word come from? Right? Lacking? No, Africa. Both are the same. Then if he said black community, you said Africa. But both are the same. But Jazakallah khair for the reflection. So this word, very clearly, in precision, in its history, comes from Europe against the Jewish community. Italy, Venice, any of you, if you have ever traveled to Venice, it's a beautiful place. SubhanAllah. It's a canal-based system that they have. When I was there, it was marvelous to experience that, something, SubhanAllah. So in Italy, this Venice, there was a place that was within Venice, a place that was isolated for this community, forced to live in. And they had this place, they only lived there. And Hassan is, mashallah, Sheikh Hassan looking at me because he lived in Italy. Here, the one sitting next to you. Suddenly, mashallah, he became awake because he lived in Italy for a long time. But you were not there when they were having that issue. So in Italy, Venice is the place, of course, there was a section of Venice that was assigned for the Jewish community, isolated, to live there. And they had specific jobs that they were allowed to work. This type of discrimination. So that is what this word ghetto itself is an Italian word. You know it, right? It's an Italian word. So it comes from Italy and it comes from Europe, and it was used against this community to cut them off from the rest of the world and rest of the society. Now it is a global word used against any community, but the history is this. It comes from here. So this is how they were treated. And today, West, champions itself in civil rights movements and also equality. So even this thing, of course, was completely a taboo for the West and the Europe and the Western world to imagine giving this to this community. The Jewish community is what I'm talking about. So the whole time, as they were living in Europe, they were always, like as I said, nomadic and persecuted, pogroms in either Western Europe or Eastern Europe, being massacred and killed and forced from one place to the other place. That is how they had been living their life. And there was this idea, this notion of equal citizenship that existed, but they were never given equal citizenship. So like I said, when was the first time, if you recall, the idea of equal citizenship was even entertained for them? Right? I talked about this. If you remember, French Revolution. French Revolution, it was late 18th century. French Revolution was the one that paved the path and charted the way for them in this regard. because that was a very turning point in the history of Europe. It was essentially against the dictatorship of religious authorities, but with that this idea and notion was entertained that the other community, the Jewish community, should also be given the equal citizenship right, which means they were always marginalized and they were treated as second-class citizen. Second-class citizen. They would not be given the privileges as Europeans, as Christians and whatnot. The other word that you generally are very familiar in, there are laws passed, in the West especially, if you use it openly and clearly using it against them, when I think more than a year ago, when this whole issue against our Muslim brothers and sisters in Gaza had started, so there was this meeting that was organized by one of the politicians in downtown. So, and I was also given the opportunity to join. So there was a representation from Muslim community and a representation from the Jewish community. There were a number of rabbis as well, about I think 8 or 10 of them. So, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself was there in that meeting. So one of the concerns they raised in that meeting was, they said, we fear through these protests that are taking place, the whole issue of anti-Semitism being promoted. So we know the word anti-Semitism. It is a crime if you use the words that are very derogatory against them. But where does this come from? It comes clearly from Europe. It's purely a European concept. Dare I say, but I'm not painting it again, don't misunderstand me. This is also a Christian problem. It is also a Christian problem. It has nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with Muslims. And why and how? Again, because of their experience and their life in Europe, under the rule and authority of European communities and Christian communities. Because of that, they were always targeted. And then we have discussed these things. So whether it is the word ghetto or equal citizenship concept or even anti-Semitism, it is, as one of the scholars said, it's purely through and through European. Through and through. There is nothing other than that. The whole word developed, became a concern because of the abuse and mistreatment and whatnot. So that was the situation. The history itself was like that, but that started to shift now from 18th century onward. Because, like I said, French Revolution brought a big revolution in the life of this community. And as it brought a big change in the life of the community, they were given, for the first time, the first country that granted them the equal citizenship right in Europe was, which country was that? It was France. It was France as the first country to give them this equal citizenship right, that you are going to be treated as equal to anyone else in France. That was the first one. And of course, the other countries followed with them. So then, and we also discussed how there was the same country in the history we talked about that had a ban on Jewish presence. Right? The same country. Remember, we talked about it. The king, the French king Philip, had banned their presence, saying either you leave or you convert to Christianity or you will be killed. So the same country became the first country because of the revolution to grant them this. So they started within the short period of time, no need to repeat that whole episode of it again, gaining power, becoming wealthy, and actively participating in the society. We discussed the plan, right? We have discussed, because again, when you miss these information that we had discussed, so you may not be able to connect to that, but we discussed these things before. So they were able to make their way to power, to wealth, to position, and the rest. So with that, they started now envisioning a dreamland for them. The dreamland. And of course, the dreamland was, lo and behold, it was Palestine, right? A national Jewish home. a homeland for the Jewish community. So that was their vision and that was their dream. And so what they started doing, of course, they were small in number, but there was this massive persecution taking place, and it changed where? In Europe. But around the same time, there were some incidents that took place in Russia, and Russia had taken very strict policy against the Jewish community. So now the Jewish community in Europe reached out to the European authorities to intervene in this regard, to be the arbitrary on their behalf, to speak to Russian authority, the Tsar government, the kings, to not kill them, rather to allow them to move and migrate. This was one thing. And on the other hand, what they did is that they used the same European power now, because Europe had a lot of influence on Ottoman Empire because of its weaker state of the Ottoman Empire. So now they made the same authorities as an agent to speak to the Ottoman Empire, so that they accommodate the Jewish population that were under attack, under persecution in Russia. So as a result of that, they say about 2 to 5 million Jews moved. SubhanAllah, this is the generosity, right? Because of the situation, Muslim, like I said, Islam for anyone does not allow any kind of injustice. So for the Khulafa, they had accommodated, and the accommodation was made in a manner that, SubhanAllah, they were able to come to the Ottoman land and live in Ottoman lands, all over. But the policy we know that was adopted by one of the Khulafa of the Ottoman Empire, Salim I and the Suleiman the Magnificent. Remember that he did not allow Jews to settle in Palestine because of the certain types of planning that they had been making with respect to acquiring the land in Palestine. Right? So he opened the door, and a significant population of them moved here. Some of them went to America, and some even South America, and some, of course, remained in Europe. But a big portion of them came to the Ottoman lands. So as they were becoming stronger, so the dream that they wanted to achieve was, of course, is to have a national, homeland for them. This individual who is a very popular man, Theodor Herzl, the one who was basically the mastermind and the founder of the modern political Zionism. The modern political Zionism, this word, as we don't know, the issue that whatever the issue is has been happening now, primarily because of this movement. It's a purely politicized movement, under the pretext of the religion. So Theodor Herzl was the man in the late 19th century. Of course, he laid the foundation to the world Zionist movement, and he was the one to organize the first Zionist conference as well, that took place in Europe. So he wrote an interesting book, and that book was the book really, charted the vision for them initially. It is called The Jewish State. It's a book worth reading for you to understand how they had envisioned this thing. So this individual, he wrote this book, which really became very popular, may not be so right at the same time, but in the subsequent period. And so if you read, one of the interesting things in that, you find he argued by saying that there can never be a solution for the Jewish community with respect to anti-Semitism and whatnot in Europe. The persecution can never end against them. Based on historical reasoning and experience, he was right in that sense. Europe will never be able to accept and allow Jews to assimilate in Europe fully and integrate well. So that was the line of argument. And then he said, therefore, there must be a country created for them where they could all move and live. So that was the suggestion. Now, what is interesting is this, is he also said, he gave two options. Of course, he said the first option is ideally, possibly, Palestine, because of the historic reasoning and the religious sentiments attached to it. But he himself said that it is not going to be easily possible. It is not going to be, keep your question to the end. تفضل تستطيع أن تذهب إلى جانب المسجد وتدعو بنفسك كما تشاء. تستطيع وهذا لابد لك أن تحترم. قلت لك no, we have time. No, we have time. Yeah. If you have issue, you can go and read, but plug your ears. Enough. Either you, yeah, okay. You have to respect the system. No, we have the time. We have. Okay. Shh. Class. No. So we have this every day. You are not sitting here, so you don't know. Khalas, inshallah, we'll end it soon. Just wait a few minutes, okay? Because this is online too, so don't make a problem. You don't know this is the problem, right? Yeah. So anyway, this individual that I was talking about, so when he wrote that book, so he suggested that there should be a country for the Jewish community, and that country should be the homeland for them, so that they no longer have the issues as they faced and experienced in Europe. On the other hand, they are able to grow, they are able to preserve their traditions and religion and the rest, all of that. So it was this argument. But what I was trying to say is that when he talked about the solution and suggestion, the first I said, of course, ideally if possible, Palestine, but because of the reasoning and the situation and the Ottoman Empire and the authority of Ottoman Empire and the policy, he says it doesn't seem to be easily possible. So then he gave the second option. He said the second option is actually Argentina. He said Argentina in South America, because of the land that was available and the possibility of it. So he suggested that Argentina should be the second option for the Jews to choose as their national homeland. So what we understand from this, if it was not to be anything other than Palestine, he would have never said this. Because they use the argument saying, it is a religious right, it is something that, their religious texts give them, and this is God-given right that this land has been given forever to them. So when that was the issue, so when he himself suggested this, that means that there was this flexibility. And in the history we also find, on other occasion, a land in Africa was actually suggested. Europeans, they suggested, okay, when they were negotiating this whole issue with European countries and authorities, so we will give you a land, somewhere in Kenya side, in Africa. We will give that land to your community. Okay. So these were the options given. So this book that became basically a milestone, although the idea was great because he was the first one to popularize this idea, publicly speaking, to popularize the idea. And it became, as they say, too good to be true. But they knew the challenges in this regard. They didn't take it too seriously. But he worked towards this. And so he suggested that there should be two things in place. One is the campaign and active system to pressure and also convince the world leaders to come together to facilitate this. That was one thing. And the second, he said, funds needs to be raised so that you really have strong financial backup, because money, speaks, as they say, right? And they were able to do whatever they were able to do, and they are able to do because even today, because of their wealth, the control that they have over wealth. So that is why these were the suggestions that he made. And then, so of course, this never became possible because he died in 1904 or 1903, I think, sometime along these. So he died in Europe, what is known as Austria today. But when they were able to finally, the Jews able to create a country for them, the actual place, the dreamland for them, the historic place for them, Palestine and Israel. So this shows that how loyal they were to the dream of this man. So he died 1904, right? So quite a few decades ago. So he died buried there. But when they finally succeeded in creating Israel, so they named a mountain and a cemetery after him, Herzl Mountain, something like that. But also they transported his remains from Europe to Israel, and they buried him there. His qabr is actually in Israel today, just to honor this man, because it was him who paved the path for them, in this regard. So they used this, they became the second force externally pressurizing the Ottomans and also weakening the empire, because they were the big hurdle along the way. And these were the external ones. And now turn to finally just two other sources, then we will conclude. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. So, like I said, active elements that were working against the Ottoman Empire. So within the empire, there were those who actually also worked in the interest of Europe against their own brethren and their own Muslim brothers. It is very sad. Arab nationalism. You all, at least those of you who are young, Lawrence of Arabia, this famous movie, you watched it. You thought that it was a real. It was nothing but a fabricated, fake, forged, and cunning planning. Very cunning planning. Arabs became victim of that. They fell prey to it. They worked against their own brothers. And the very Ottoman Empire, in serving the interest of the imperialism. How naive could you be? People are worried about dua, dhikr, but this is what also you need to worry about. Right? This is also you need to worry about. There are leaders just invested in the self-interest of the authority and politics and the wealth. They traded their country. They traded their nation. They traded their religion. They cheated the system. Arab nationalism. As much as you lament over other elements, what about your own mess that you have in your own house? So this man from Britain became a hero in that movie. He was a big shaitan, working as an agent of British to destroy Ottomans, riling up Arabs in Jaziratul Arab against Ottomans. Just watch the documentary, that movie, and read the book. You will know all about it. Time doesn't allow me. It is this that really saddens me. It is this that really hurts me. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. So because as we go further, we will inshallah look at it, how the very same people who they promised this land, how they cheated them and how they defeated them, how they tricked them and completely ignored them after their purpose was fulfilled. You will see that. Now, that was another issue within Arab world and Muslim world. Now, within Turkey itself, we talked about Donmi, right? And this young Turk movement full of youngsters who were very much fascinated by the Western culture, Western ideas, Western lifestyle, the language and the rest. So they were their history, as I said, many of the leaders of the Young Turk movement, they belonged to Donmi, who actually eventually were the Jewish community, Jews who lived. So because, remember when we talked about a big portion of Jews moving into the Ottoman land from Russia, so as they scattered all over Ottomans, so a big portion of them also came to Turkey. They lived in Turkey and they settled there. So they also actively worked in destroying the Ottoman Empire. Christians, the Jews, and the Arabs, and the so-called Turkish Muslims in the name of Ottomans. So we need to look in our own selves. And this is the history. This is unfortunately history. You always have traitors in yourselves, among yourselves. Anyway, we will end here, and inshallah we'll continue tomorrow. But these were the contributing elements that really, fulfill the dream of the Jews and the Christians and the rest of the world against Muslims and Islam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to wake us up, right? Reading this and listening to this, to have a deeper thinking, critical thinking, a thinking that is going to change us, inshallah, to be a better Muslim and have a better vision for the religion of Islam. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, wa nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayh. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
उर्दू में है इसकी ट्रांसलेशन ये इसकी ट्रांसलेशन ये किताब में लिखी है
नहीं वो तो खैर उसमें सारी चीज़ें नहीं, वो तो मुख्तलिफ सोर्सेस हैं, उसमें जो है अहम पॉइंट्स होते हैं, तो वो मैं इसका सामने रखूँगा कि फोकस लगे बात
नहीं आप